We're on part 5 of Error 5 study guide. So question 31 is, what is a tariff and why are tariffs good and why can tariffs be bad? So a tariff is just a tax on foreign or imported goods. Basically, it's a tax on anything that is not made in your country. So like Chinese made products or whatever, okay? So it can be good for a nation because what it does is it protects your domestic, your American-made goods. And when you protect American-made goods, suddenly the American-made good is the cheapest good on the shelf. So it reduces foreign competition. It can also be bad because it drives up the cost of living. So remember what I showed you with the hat and the British hat versus the American hat. And that's going to become an issue because when you look at it, you used to be able to buy that cheap foreign good and it was like $2.50. But now because of the tariff, it's $4. The American-made good was always $3 and is going to now be $3. So you're spending 50 cents more on the American-made good, which is now the cheapest made good on the shelf. So this is why people sometimes get upset about tariffs. It eliminates competition and it makes the American companies have pretty much a monopoly. So when you go to the store, you're going to buy the American-made item because it's the cheapest made item. And sometimes you stop international sales. Sometimes international trade goes away when tariffs are too high. Question 32 is, why is Henry Clay considered the great compromiser in American history? It's like Henry Clay comes to the rescue every single time America is going to fall apart. So the first time he comes to the rescue is the American system. And he creates that economic plan where he recreates the bank, he creates infrastructure, and he goes ahead and he increases tariffs. So he does it to protect northern industries, but to kind of bridge the economic gap that we had in the country. The South was definitely the wealthier area. And with this policy, you're actually going to kind of bring these two divisions, these two parts of the country, a little bit more economically together. He also creates that Missouri Compromise. He comes up with this plan that Maine is going to enter as a free state, Missouri is going to enter as a slave state, and everything north of Missouri is going to go ahead and be a free state, and everything south of Missouri is going to be a slave state. So he comes up with that. Then he comes up with the Compromise of 1850. In the Compromise of 1850, the reason why it's happened is because in 1849, California has had a huge gold rush, and they actually had it in 48, but in 49 you really see the effects. That's why we call it the 49ers, San Francisco, right? So as that has happened, California wants to be a state. They are no longer wanting to be a territory. But if you look at this little line that old Missouri Compromise line had created, about half of California is technically in a slave zone. Half of it's in a free zone. So Henry Clay decides, let's go ahead and come up with something that the South wants. Let's come up with something that I can get the North and the South on the same page. So he does. California enters as a free state like they wanted to be. The South is going to get a very strict fugitive slave law. And that fugitive slave law is, you can actually get slaves that have run away up here. And so the North gets something and the South gets something. Popular sovereignty, voting on whether these new territories want to be slave or free, is going to be allowed. And no more slave trade here in the District of Columbia, D.C. So that's our nation's capital. So the North got no more slave trade in D.C. The South kind of gets this popular sovereignty that, they feel that it'll allow them to have more slave states. And you have to look at it their way. As they've been expanding, every single state that comes into the United States that a slave state touches has become a slave state. Louisiana, Texas. Louisiana was a slave state. Texas enters as a slave state. So wherever slavery kind of shares a border, you kind of see slavery kind of infiltrating and taking over. So he comes up with that compromise. Everybody's on board. The North gets two things, the South gets two things, and everybody signs off on it. He also helps with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This Kansas-Nebraska territory is going to get split up, And it's all about trying to allow slavery to expand and allow slavery to not expand in certain parts, and it's going to be based off popular sovereignty again. So you're going to allow people to vote, and then we get some really bad incidences, and we'll look more at that in Era 6 on this one. So each of these required him to get the North, South, and West to agree to do what is best for the nation, and that is called nationalism. So he normally calls on other people to get him some help on getting their region, their area, to go ahead and agree. He even calls on South Carolinian John C. Calhoun to help him out in a couple of things. So he calls on Webster, another Northerner, because Clay is kind of from the West. So you kind of get people, he pulls on these like notable figures from their region to get these plans enacted. Question 33 is, what was the Transcendentalist movement and who are the Transcendentalists? So the Transcendentalists are just authors. They're philosopher kind of authors. They believe that individualism and self-reliance are key to our success. So if we want to be a great nation, we actually have to encourage individualism, that people can think for themselves and think as individuals. And we have to encourage self-reliance. You and only you rely on yourself, not on everybody else. So they kind of really didn't like this whole factory system kind of process, because in a factory system, you're turning a human being into a machine. You're not allowing individualism. You're not allowing free thought. And so they kind of don't like it, and they write a lot about how factories are kind of killing the American creativity, the American individualism. Remember the artisans. The artisans are creating a product from start to finish. And therefore, you're allowed to make changes. You're allowed to make differences. So they like that more than they did this whole, factory system. They also believe that if you don't agree with a law, that you must peacefully protest it. This is passive resistance, kind of, okay? So when you look at Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, they are the leaders of the Transcendentalist movement. This passive resistance, the civil disobedience is stuff they're going to write about. And think about civil disobedience like Dr. King. So Martin Luther King Jr., when he's making his marches and civil rights is going on, civil rights protesters were hurt and abused by the local population. Dogs sat on them, a fire hose. They got hit with trash can lids. And every time that happened, he told the people, don't hit back. We have to civilly disobey the law. We have to peacefully resist it. Thoreau does this. He doesn't agree with the Mexican-American War. He refuses to pay a tax. So he refuses to pay the tax and he goes to jail. So he actually does civil disobedience. So if you don't agree with the law, they basically say you have an obligation to peacefully protest it, to civilly disobey it. Question 34, what was the Hudson River School of Art and how is it a good example of nationalism? Basically, this is what they do. They make these wonderful landscape paintings of America. Not necessarily like people or anything, but just the majestic beauty of our country, the mountains. And mainly they do like the Catskills Mountains, the Hudson River area. So they show our oceans, they show our rivers, they show our beautiful trees, the wonderful skyline. It shows how gorgeous our country is, and it makes people proud to be Americans and to preserve what we have. Question 35 is, why are James Fenimore Cooper, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Washington Irving considered the first American authors? All these guys do is write about Americans living in America. Previously to them, we don't have any what we would call true American authors. They're writing about things in Europe. They're not writing about how we are living here in America. And our experiences are different than European experiences. Our experiences are, that rugged kind of individualism that we'll eventually get to, believe in all this stuff. But they're writing about how we are dealing with the environment, how we're dealing with nature, what's going on with us. So, Cooper writes the Last of the Mohicans. Edgar Allan Poe is kind of your modern day, thriller, author. And, he writes The Raven, but he is writing about stuff about Americans in the United States. Hawthorne, same thing. Irving, same thing. They're just writing about the American experience. Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, about Puritans and the colonies and how they react to living in the Americas. And Irving's the same thing. And you guys know, like, The Headless Horseman, that's his story. But he writes about Ichabod Crane dealing with some, deranged demon trying to kill him.